Coming up on AVANT Technology Insights with Ken Presti. Ransomware, COVID, a major breach, and then some. Will things ever get back to normal? We're talking to a security industry analyst who has written several books, including one on IT security in 2020, and is in the midst of putting together his sequel for 2021. We'll talk about SASE, the impacts of the coronavirus, cloud versus prem, and of course, what's coming down the pike with the SolarWinds breach. You won't want to miss this one. Welcome to AVANT Technology Insights. I'm your host, Ken Presti, Vice President of AVANT Research and Analytics. The link between solving business challenges and cutting-edge technologies has become tighter and more complex than ever before. In this podcast series from AVANT Research and Analytics, we help enterprise decision makers sort through the business case, the value, the challenges, and ultimately the bottom line of technology adoption. So listen to us at your desktop, take us in the car, tune in from the commuter train, or download us at the gate. You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, and Google, as well as at www.goavant.net/podcast. My guest today is a longtime security industry analyst and author who's currently working on his 8th book, most of which are focused on IT security. He's worked for one of the first MSSPs, a major consultancy, and Gartner. He's a frequent speaker and most recently the author of the Security Yearbook 2020 with a 2021 edition on its way. Please welcome Richard Stiennon. Richard, thank you very much for joining us today. You and I have known each other for quite a while. You've been one of the great voices in the security space. I believe you're the author of 7 books, if I recall correctly, including the Security Yearbook 2020, which is now giving way to the Security Yearbook 2021. So I'll be looking to see if we can get a little bit of a teaser coming into the 2021 book, if you don't mind. But before we do that, there's a huge thing going on in the security space right now that regarding the SolarWinds breach. Wanted to ask your thoughts on that. I'm sure you've been paying a great deal of attention to it for the last several days. What are you seeing coming together as all these different sources begin to ante up with information and talk about things like mitigation and things like that? As you look at all this, how would you characterize what we're seeing here today with respect to how big this is and what we need to do?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ken. I think, when you think of it, this is a campaign. There's no better word for it. A single point of entry into a lot of targets through SolarWinds primarily. And SolarWinds, of course, being a network infrastructure management solution that's deployed to supposedly 300,000 places. But they claim they only have 18,000 customers of the Orion management solution that is vulnerable or has been corrupted by a bad update. So everybody who's received the update has probably been compromised. But if you think of that, even if there are 18,000, I'm trying to imagine the size of the crew it would take to systematically, sweep through all of them and collect all the good stuff and put it somewhere in their own data lake from the big 2020 hack. And I think most are assuming that they're being very selective of their targets, right? They got everybody. Now, which ones do they want to spend the time to penetrate? And we know of Department of Energy, DHS, Department of Commerce, National Institute of Health, and basically every couple hours we hear of a new one. And of course, the first one was FireEye, and I think that was probably their biggest mistake because going after a government agency is one thing. People who have government jobs tend to go home at 5 o'clock. At a security vendor, they're working around the clock all the time, and they're really, really good at security, especially FireEye. So it was a blunder to poke around in there and get discovered. And then
because they were most likely to get caught there, right?
Yeah. I mean, if they had gone after the NSA, it might have been the same thing. Mm-hmm. Of course, maybe they did. They're poking around the NSA all the time. When you think of the group that this is associated with, APT 29, Cozy Bear, um, we've seen descriptions of the group members before. The Dutch actually got on their systems and invaded their CCTV systems and got videos of them walking the hallways. It looks like a regular old office building.
Mhm.
But definitely, a dozen, 2 dozen top, let's call them analysts to be nice. So probably would be difficult to tackle more than even 100 of these really, really rich targets that they have ability to get complete access to.
So, to what extent do you think this was aimed primarily at these government agencies and the corporations, the companies that got sucked into this thing? Are you seeing them pretty much as collateral damage, or was this a let's cast a wide net and see what we get?
According to Microsoft, they're tracking 40 of their customers who they can tell have been um, attacked in some way. And of those 40, about 17% are government agencies. And interestingly enough, the biggest sector is tech companies, so 18%. So, no, it was like 44%. So 18 out of the 40 are actually tech companies like
Mm.
SolarWinds and FireEye and Microsoft. Um, but there could be a bunch of our big uh, telecom providers, manufacturers of networking gear, anything, right? Salesforce, who knows, that are having their data stolen from them. So some of those might actually have a bigger impact on the world than a bunch of bureaucratic emails floating back and forth at the National Institute of Health.
How would you characterize this in terms of scale and importance? One of the things that's been going on for a long time is these types of hacks, and we usually hear, this is huge, this is huge, this is the biggest thing yet. And, there's always something that is bigger still next time. Now, how much of that is hyperbole and how much of it is not? How do you perceive this particular breach in terms of overall importance?
Yeah, I look at the impact of the methodologies and technology used first. So I would put this right up there with NotPetya and the Flame uh, virus,
Hmm.
and both used a third-party supply chain kind of attack with malicious updates. Um, Flame, we have very little evidence of it being used. We don't know who the targets were. It was discovered by Kaspersky and other antivirus vendors, and it belongs to the NSA. So obviously, it would have been extremely pinpointed against particular targets, which we know, and not U.S. based, so we wouldn't hear about them.
Hmm.
NotPetya, of course, got loose into the world. It was meant to target Ukrainian organizations, and it spread everywhere, right? So Maersk and huge companies got just totally wiped out or taken down for a period of time. And NotPetya, easily the biggest damage caused from a cyber attack ever. Uh, Flame, cool technology, not necessarily damaging to anybody. This might end up only being damaging to from the perspective of lost intellectual property for corporations and lost intel for the government. So it's still going to be right in there. There'll be a chapter devoted to it in any book on nation state hacking.
Hmm.
So it's already reached that level. If there are more repercussions, as we discover the types of data that have been stolen, and luckily with government agencies, a lot of times you actually find out. They have to report that to Congress, and Congress has to tell people what happened. So
Right.
we'll have probably as good a feel for what happened as we do with the OPM attacks that China instigated.
So, if you were the CIO of a large enterprise organization, in view of what's going on this past week or so, what would you be doing right now to protect yourself or to maybe raise your security to a higher level?
It depends on two things. or I'd take two paths. One, if I were a customer of SolarWinds, I would be taking the alerts sent out by CISA and the NSA and searching for all the indicators of compromise, the hashes of all the files and such, to see if I was being exploited in any way. And then I would take the advice of updating all my SolarWinds. If I wasn't a SolarWinds customer and therefore not a potential target to be included in this, I would start thinking seriously about which software updates do I trust and install regularly, and what could be the damage done if they were malicious. And of course, that's going to be all your software. So if you still have enterprise level software, which interesting with cloud transformation is going to end up being network management kind of stuff, because your HR software, your finance software, your CRM software is all outsourced to be somebody else's problem in the cloud.
Yeah, the cloud has certainly changed everything with respect to security. Tee that up for me a little bit. I mean, obviously there's some obvious difference, but you've got network security in the age of the cloud, not just in terms of this technology itself, although there's certainly that, but also in terms of how you plan, manage, and strategize security. Is it fair to say that somebody who gets caught up in the Solar Winds breach did so without any fault of their own, or are there things that people should have been looking for in order to prevent this?
Yeah, I tend to victim blame when it's something like ransomware, right?
Mm.
Somebody shouldn't have clicked on an email, and you shouldn't allow them to click on malicious emails anyway. So there's all sorts of things you could have done. In this case, you're not exactly blameless, and only the most mature companies would have been able to detect the lateral movement. But we know, there's probably at least a dozen who are succumbing to this. Not a single one of them, until FireEye, detected that lateral movement.
Right.
So people's threat hunting and security analytics and all that stuff is that I talk to vendors of these products every single day. Obviously, it's not very well deployed inside most organizations yet, especially in the government.
Okay. Let me change gears on you for a minute. And this was where I thought I was going to start until this whole solar winds thing blew up. But we've been talking quite a bit about secure access service edge, and I've done a couple of podcasts on that in particular. Where does SASE fit into the new world, if you will, of security infrastructure, and how would you define it, and to what extent do you see it as a game changer in the security space?
It's an easy for me. It's really easy to just say, that stack of network gear in the data center that you used to have for filtering everybody's access to the internet, and everything that comes in has to go through a firewall and IPS and load balancing, all that stuff.
You mean
We
that
already
stuff
went
that's
through,
sitting in the alley right now?
yeah, all that stuff. You can move to the alley if you move to the cloud.
Right.
And the very first phase of that, I was, the first I was the Gartner analyst, following all these different technologies that belonged in the network gateway, and writing the magic quadrants for them. Soon after I left, started to recognize that they were collapsing into multifunction boxes that IDC called UTM, and for some bizarre reason, Gartner called the next gen firewall. But basically, yeah, just do all those in one box. Now, mind
Mhm.
you, those boxes were extremely expensive, right? $1 million a piece, and you needed two of them because they needed to be up all the time. And they did so much, right? To have the proper throughput, you needed a really big hunk of iron. I guess technically it's a big hunk of silicon. And the vendors, your Palo Altos and your Fortinets and even your Sonic Walls and Checkpoint, spent a lot of money on developing high throughput capability, either using Broadcom chips or customizing their own. In the cloud, your users aren't on your corporate network. They're sitting at home. And at one point before all this started, they were in a Starbucks and they needed to get access to applications hosted either in your data center or the cloud. And you used to backhaul them through your VPN, put them on the corporate network where they had wide open access to everything, like they're sitting in the office, and then they'd get to wherever they're going, even if it meant just going back out to Google search. Now, instead of that, you go to a SASE provider, which is, just think of it as a big reverse CDN. So instead of hosting somebody else's content and getting it close to you, it's hosting a gateway that's as close as possible to you and gets you on the, fast track to wherever you're going as quickly as possible, and uses thousands of machines to do what one stack of hardware used to do. And it develops, first of all, it means the enterprise no longer has to worry about the network, right? They don't spend any time at all worrying about the network. They worry about the user experience. So there might be networking issues locally, and somewhere in North Dakota, somebody says they can't get to Teams, and you might have to debug that. But it's not your fault. It's going to be the telecom provider's fault. So you still have to work those issues. But in the meantime, where they can go is controlled and filtered and band, rate limited if needed. Their voice over IP is given the highest SLA. Just everything just works, and it's simple, and you've got a really granular cloud-based policy for who gets to do what at what time and from where.
So is this a solution for everybody or a solution for a few?
It is a solution for the large enterprise first, those that have big security stacks, and because the vendor that kind of invented all this was Zscaler, and their initial go-to-market model was for a medium enterprise to give the medium enterprise what the big guys had, and it turned out the big guys wanted it, so they kind of shifted gears and just served the very large companies. And then along came some other companies that are serving the mid-market, so Perimeter 81, which can actually go all the way down to the small businesses as well. And I'm still waiting for the solution that a very small business like mine, 2 or 3 computers and no network, just Wi-Fi,
Right.
that would give me that direct access. As it is now, I still need hardware appliances for my own security.
So it pretty much tracks the usual model. It starts at the top and then starts to roll down as it becomes more familiar and a little bit more plug and play as things go along.
That's the usual model for security. Yes, yeah, not technology. Technology usually starts at the end user, and I've lived through that for email. We had AOL before we had corporate email and exchange. Certainly for Wi-Fi, right? Most organizations in the early 2000s said no Wi-Fi allowed. That's dangerous stuff.
Right.
And now they have to have it.
Exactly. So you are the author of a number of books, including Secure Cloud Transformation, the CIO's Journey, and also the Security Yearbook 2020. And you mentioned when we spoke earlier that you are in the process of working on Security Yearbook 2021. What can you tell us about the 2021 edition? What are you seeing in 2021 that is different from 2020?
Well, first of all, I'm adding 700 vendors to the directory. And that's not necessarily 700 new vendors. It's just 700 that I didn't know about. So there will be 3,000 vendors in the new book, arranged by category and by country, and I list the number of employees in each one. So it gives you some reliable data about the size of the company. And then, but the front end of the book is the history. So I have to augment it every year with a history of what happened. And in this case, it'll be what happened in 2020. Big items now are COVID and the impact that had on the industry, and the SolarWinds attack. I generally don't, I've written 2 books on cyber attacks, right? So Surviving Cyber War was one, and there will be cyber wars, one about military attacks. And they cover the history of these influential wake up call kind of attacks. And so I left those out completely of Security Yearbook. And I'll still do that. I'm not going to cover those because there's plenty of other books about those attacks. This is the only history of our industry. It goes, all the way back to the development of RACF and ACF2 for privileged access, or just user access in general, and data security, and the founding of Checkpoint, etc. So this year I'll have a summary of all the new fundings and the M&A that happened. And, if it deserves talking about, it won't just list it. I'll describe what I think the impact on the industry that means, or what it indicates about what the acquiring companies are looking for.
So at the beginning of 2020, enterprises and basically everybody beat a hasty retreat to a widely distributed, typically home-based workforce. How much trouble did that cause on the security front? Would you say that most companies have resolved whatever issues occurred as a result of that? And where do we stand now?
Yeah, I'm incredibly impressed by how quickly people responded. They literally, in 2 or 3 days, got everybody up and running. There was a company here in Detroit that had 30,000 employees who worked in the office, and they got them all up and running at home with new computers in a week. Um, and that company's been just booming during the downturn. For some reason, what they do is going up instead of going down. The security repercussions we have yet to see. I think we saw a huge spike in phishing attacks that we thought were all about installing ransomware, and some of those were successful, and we heard about those throughout the year. But phishing attacks can open the door too, and it might, if the average dwell time for a successful attack is 210 days, we're only going to start hearing about those major breaches about now. Now, if you think about it, even the SolarWinds attack started in March, so maybe it could be lumped into those that took that long, had that long dwell time to be discovered.
And would you say that, would I be correct in assuming that that's a huge amount of dwell time, or do I just not know about the level of dwell time because people would probably be less interested in sharing that?
Yeah, somehow the Ponemon Institute gets people to share that in a survey. To me, it tells a lot about the maturity of a company if they actually track that metric. So I don't know if people just take a stab at it, or they only have one incident and they know it well, so they can say how long it was between the initial attack and the discovery, which is the dwell time. So I tend to believe it. Right? We've got examples of companies that were compromised for 10 years, where every email sent by all the top executives also went to China, and they did discover it for 10 years.
Is this mostly an identity and access management issue, or are there a lot more methods of attack? That people are really leveraging at a high end, because it would seem to me that one of the best ways to get into that level of information is to be able to spoof some high level executive.
Yeah, and identity and access management is always the best line of defense. Just all you got to do is crank up how well you do that, and the granularity of what you allow people access to. But you'll stop all of your own employees from doing bad things if you just make them log in, right? Because
Right.
they know and tell them that you're monitoring what they do. An attacker attempts to get the same level of access and authorizations. Interestingly, there's one company that's tracking you know, ransomware attacks, and they claim over 60% are actually come in via RDP, which is a vulnerability introduced when companies sent their employees home. They allowed them to use remote desktop protocol to get to their desktop at work, and that was the way they got them onto the corporate network. And ransomware is spreading over that more than anything else, even more than phishing attacks.
So, given the fact that security is such a rapidly moving thing, as we all know, in view of the expanding attack surfaces and the creativity around the attack vectors, what would you say are the main ways that you expect IT security to evolve over the course of the next 12 months? In other words, how much, if we were doing the same interview at this time next year, how do you think the discussion would change?
Well, we know what you have to do, right? You have to have these SOC capabilities, assuming you patch regularly and know about all that stuff and you encrypt all your data at rest. And there's quite a few companies already do. But it's this huge burden for somebody to undo any of it, right? So if you're a small manufacturer or a shipper or something like that, you just bought a Windows server system to handle your email 10 years ago and you're still using it, you've got a long way to go to get up to speed.
Mhm.
Obviously, this is where managed security service providers come in and take that off of the things you have to do. But people don't actually go around looking for those solutions until after they've been breached, right? They don't read my blogs and my books. I can't warn everybody to take a step that they're not taking. So it doesn't make any sense to them. So there'll be just a continuation of breaches like this forever,
Mhm.
never going away. And yet, optimistic on my part, I'm optimistic that those that understand the danger can protect themselves against all but, NSA level types of penetrations.
Okay, so given that, and given the fact that there are now cyber insurance policies floating around out there, how important are those policies and what do you have to look at to make sure that they actually do much of anything at all? I mean, I've been hearing a lot about how the policies, how some are better than others, some have all kinds of backdoors to prevent them from paying out. What are the things to look out for there?
Yeah, kind of find out who the real underwriter is. There's only a handful of companies that actually do the underwriting, but there are 200 companies that say they sell cyber insurance. Quite a lot, like life insurance is.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, you have to look close. So you probably do want cyber insurance that covers you for paying the ransoms to recover your data or to prevent the attacker from leaking it publicly. Um, and those are getting a little trickier because the cyber insurance companies are paying it out a lot and they don't like it. Um, Pay attention to the fact that you're not allowed to publicize that you have it. It's a little bit like uh, ransom insurance for kidnapping. You're not allowed to say, "Yeah, I'm covered for $2 million." That makes you a target for a kidnapper. Same with ransomware.
Right.
Um, yeah, I'm really look at that balance, right? Yeah, you're going to be paying uh, maybe 1% of what the possible payout is. That's great, but maybe you could spend a little more money in your security because you still don't
Mhm.
want the hassle of, it's if you had perfect house insurance to prevent fires, or to recover from a fire, you still don't want to have a fire. That's very disruptive, and it's just like a cyber attack.
Richard, what makes you shake your head in the security front? Not just thinking about insurance per se, but the overall approach to security. Sometimes you can look at somebody and think, okay, what are these people thinking? Um, what makes you think that, in terms of securing their data, securing their infrastructure, and they just ought to know better?
I guess I'm historically very frustrated with the idea that you can just turn on all your systems alerts and watch the traffic going over the wire and compare it to tens of thousands of signatures and create alerts from that. And that you can do something with millions and millions of alerts every day. I don't believe you can. And I think all the effort and expense you put into deriving some intelligence from all those alerts and focusing on one or two things a day, you're still going to miss the Solar Winds attack because it acted like a Solar Winds installation and it wouldn't have triggered anything, and it didn't trigger anything.
Nothing to
So,
see here, folks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm starting to think of each security technology in two different categories. One is the collect it all and analyze it. So everybody talks to you about security analytics or XDR, MDR, EDR. All of them are in that collect a bunch of data and apply machine learning to it and artificial intelligence, and it will tell you the magic alert that you have to pay attention to. So I'm starting to put those in one category, and then things that are proactive security in the other, things that stop bad stuff from happening. So firewalls, perfect example. It's firewall, you turn off telnet at the gateway and there will be no telnet. So it doesn't matter if you have vulnerable telnet going on inside your network. Nobody's going to see it or attack it. Other things are, blocking all advertising on your desktop. So use an ad blocker, right? Now you're not going to succumb to water hole attacks or malicious ads that are served up to you.
Right.
So the list just goes on, and by the end of the day, you've only got two categories of security solutions.
All right. So Security Yearbook 2021, when can we expect that to be on the shelves?
That'll be out in May. I had shifted for two reasons. One, I really wanted to be done with the year 2020 before I write about it.
Don't we all? Yeah.
And line up the data I now collect on the number of employees in each company, line it up with the end of the year. So I didn't have to report on the first three quarters of 2020. And also, the big launch event is always around RSA or at RSA. And first of all, it was going to be virtual, and now, or first of all, it was moved to May. So that gave me that extra time I needed to get the book out.
And the thing I like about your books is they walk that thin line between there's plenty of technology stuff in there, but you're also talking to a business audience as well.
Right.
And that's something that I've always appreciated. So where do you find it? Where do you find your books?
You can find them all on Amazon.
Okay.
And, some of them I published myself, so I've got kind of control over it. And some I didn't, so I don't control anything about them. But the best place to get Security Yearbook is right off the IT Harvest website. And that you get the better book there, right? Because these are pre-printed, bound with a traditional library binding.
Nice.
Whereas the one you buy on Amazon is printed on demand. So it's a glued kind of binding.
Okay, gotcha. All right, Richard Stiennon, a chief research analyst at IT Harvest and the author of 7 books, I believe, and soon to be 8. Thank you very much for your time today, sir. Great discussion on security at a very critical time for IT security. So we appreciate your time here today, sir.
Thanks, Ken. It was great.
You've been listening to AVANT Technology Insights with Ken Presti, featuring information and opinions on how key technologies can be leveraged to solve business problems. AVANT Technology Insights is a service of AVANT Communications, a platform for IT decision-making. All opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guest and the host. For more information, please feel free to download our research reports and other resources at www.goavant.net. That's www.goavant, as in victory, ant.net. For AVANT Research and Analytics, I'm Ken Presti.